This is the Soul-Filled Sisterhood podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Burgess, licensed marriage and family therapist and an empowerment mentor for women. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute, nor is it to convey professional, psychological, financial, or medical advice. If you could use such services, please seek them out from someone you trust. Now here is today's episode. Episode 24. Today's episode is sponsored by Nicole Burgess, empowerment mentor for helping women remove their good girl mask and their people-pleasing behavior and let their authentic and powerful self arise so they can create a more soul-filled life. For more information, go out to NicoleBurgessCoaching.com/inner truth. I'm really excited about sharing today's episode. I invited Terri on because I wanted to really learn a little more about how she has reversed diabetes and the methods that she has used to do that. In my family, there are some health issues that are going on within my relatives and immediate family, and so I wanted to learn a little bit more about going outside the traditional systems. And Terri really has opened my eyes to these other possibilities, and I hope that you find her information inspiring and maybe even getting more curious about what you can do. I also know, as somebody in her midlife, that our bodies definitely change and how our systems work with what we're eating and what we're doing, that impacts everything. And so again, part of this is more of my own curiosity, and I hope you find this as inspirational, and Terri's work and how she's changing women's lives and how she's impacting our world. I hope you find it helpful. Well, welcome, sisters. Oh, I'm so excited about my next guest. I have Terri Lance on today, and she has been a psychologist in private practice for almost 15 years and was a middle school teacher prior to that. She is now working with individuals who want to take their challenges with health and weight into their own hands and find lasting positive results. She combines her knowledge of how our bodies work and interact with our environment, as well as our interpersonal and intrapersonal dynamics around health, weight, and self-care to empower people to heal and enjoy their bodies as healthy vehicles for life. She loves helping folks to find a sustainable way of eating that supports their optimal health and weight outcomes without shaming and blaming. And I met Terri, it's probably, at the time of this recording, it's probably been about 3 to 4 months ago. And the way she approaches this topic just really fascinated me. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today, Terri.
Well, thanks, Nicole. I'm happy to be here and excited to let some other people hear about what's going on.
Excellent. Well, would you mind sharing just a little bit with our listeners, like really what brought you into being a coach specifically on this metabolic health and weight loss that you do?
I think primarily, years as a psychotherapist, really enjoyed that work, but my own health journey was not going well. I'd struggled with my weight all of my life and had been diagnosed type 2 diabetic probably about 14 years prior to kind of transitioning. And I feel like my work as a therapist was helping people work on some aspects of health, but really missing some key factors. So as I got more involved in my own health journey and taking it back into my own hands and resolving my health concerns, I realized that this is what I wanted to do with other people. And so as a therapist, needed another way to reach people to focus on their health concerns.
Awesome. Well, would you mind sharing a little more? I know that you have talked a little bit about the metabolic conditions. Would you mind sharing what does that even mean, or what does that look like?
Sure. Metabolic conditions, if you were to Google it, you're going to find that there are 100 or more that are that actually are genetic. And those aren't the ones I'm talking about. Those would be things like Tay-Sachs disease and things like that. They're usually about some kind of enzyme that is present or not present that interferes with the metabolism of nutrients. The metabolic conditions I'm talking about are more like metabolic syndrome, PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome,
Oh,
and diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and prediabetes. And the reason I cover these and I cover them along with weight is that really fundamentally the same issues are the causes for all of these conditions, and as well as weight gain and difficulty losing weight. So for me, they're all very linked.
okay. Interesting. And I know you have talked about, again, when we first kind of met, you had made a comment, and I know your website says this too, but you have a different approach than like other traditional approaches. Would you mind sharing what you even mean by that? Like, what's a typical approach versus how do you approach things?
hmm I would say, in my mind, the typical approach is what we have all heard probably all of our lives, probably in this country for the past 60 to 70 years, is that if we're having difficulty with our weight, it is related to too many calories in and not enough calories out.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, as far as the metabolic conditions, it's just genetic. It's that if you're diagnosed diabetic, type 2 diabetic, it's just a progressive disease that is just going to get worse, and you just need to kind of hang on. And I don't believe those things. I believe that we can manage our health and our weight in such a way that we can avoid the problems. And, for example, in my case, reverse the problems. But it's not about calories in versus calories out. It's not about restricting food, and it's not about low fat. And most things that most of us have ever heard about, even managing diabetes, but especially about weight loss or not gaining weight, has been focused on a low fat approach.
Yeah. And you know what you're talking about. I was trying not to chuckle too much when you started out about the whole calories in and calories out. Yeah, I've heard that for years. And sometimes the women I work with, I mean, they'll tell me about that as well when they're trying to lose weight, especially as you get to like your middle age, right? Things start to change in your body, and your hormone levels change, everything else. And there's still that old belief system. And there's other things I've read or I've heard about that's not the case. So could you share some tips, I guess, like how do women start to kind of shift that belief system or start to challenge that belief system? What has helped you really reverse those symptoms of type 2 diabetes?
Well, I think for me, a lot of self-education has gone into this. I started just poring over books and articles and scientific articles and things. But I think also, if you just look at our trends in this country, since we adapted this healthy way of eating based on the dietary guidelines that have been given to us, we have not gotten thinner.
Uh-huh.
We have not decreased the rates of diabetes and PCOS and prediabetes. Those things have like tripled. Cardiovascular disease, I think, has tripled in that time.
Wow.
Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, dementia, and Alzheimer's. So if eating this way is actually supposed to be so helpful, why are we seeing all of these things getting worse? And we've also been taught that so much of why we have diseases because it's genetic.
Mm-hmm.
That's really not true. About 85% of what leads to most of our chronic diseases or conditions is environmental and how we eat and
Wow.
what
Sorry,
we do.
that just kind of blew me away.
Yeah.
85%.
But again, we're taught that it's just those are the genes you have. Just live with it.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't live with that anymore. So I think if you just really look at, like I said, the trends, now that we are following these guidelines, and we actually have research that shows that people actually are following these guidelines, and we're getting more overweight and less healthy. So they're not working. And then I think many of your listeners might relate to this example, but The Biggest Loser. I used to love watching that show.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is the prime example of restricting calories in and burning excessive calories does not work. it works short term. You watch people on that show lose 100 pounds or 80 pounds. But when we go back and research and investigate years later, they've all gained back all of that weight and more. And they're, I'm getting a little sciencey here, but their basal metabolic rate has bottomed out so badly, they can't even eat a normal amount of food without gaining weight. So
Wow.
just further confirmation that this myth that we've been taught that calories in and versus calories out is the approach that works just is false.
There's something too that I've heard. I don't even know where I read it at, or I know this has been talked about too for years about the yo-yo dieting. Like you're saying, it sounds like if you've been watching The Biggest Loser, you watch them really lose the weight, so shed the pounds. But yeah, if it changes your internal systems, and I don't know the scientific term you just used there, but it's like, so that doesn't work. It's not like you're truly resetting your system when you do these things. You're just kind of setting your body up to say, hey, I need to kind of halt. I can't do the same thing anymore. So how do you really reset your system?
Again, I'm bordering here on wanting to share some science, but not wanting to get too technical about it.
Go for it.
It's kind of like seeing our metabolism rate as like a thermostat. And what happens is when we reduce how much energy and what we're putting in, eventually our body figures that out and has to lower how much energy it's using. So it does work in the short term.
Okay.
Your body, specifically focusing on weight loss right here, but your body will lose weight because it'll decrease how much energy it's using and it'll burn more, and so you'll burn fat. But over time, it realizes it's not going to get enough. And so it starts to shut down some functions. It lowers your body thermostat a little bit. It uses less energy for things. And then what happens, for example, in The Biggest Loser is that you get your kind of overall thermostat gets reset at a lower level. So then when you go back to eating kind of more normally, or you add back in food, your body is still set at that lower rate.
Oh, wow.
So one of the things you asked about that, as well as what you had asked earlier about, what did I do and what can people do?
Mm-hmm.
The big shift here is to look at it as, okay, so it's not about calories in, calories out, and all foods are not equal. So 100 calories of broccoli and 100 calories of Snickers bar is not the same 100 calories. So again, if I believe calories in and calories out, that should be true, but it's really not. So instead, my approach is much more focused on the hormones in your body and how they work, specifically insulin, leptin, and ghrelin, with the most primary focus on insulin. And insulin is what is really at the root cause of metabolic conditions like PCOS, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes, as well as weight gain and difficulty losing weight.
Huh.
So my approach is all about how can we decrease and manage insulin better in our body.
Fascinating. So I guess I've heard of the insulin piece of it when it comes to diabetes, but would you mind sharing just a little more, like what exactly is insulin for those who may not know exactly what it is or how our body produces it? Could you share a little more about that?
Sure. And I probably should put this disclaimer out there. I'm not a medical professional, so I'm not giving medical advice, and I'm not reading this out of a medical textbook. But basically, insulin is a hormone that is released from our pancreas, and it's vital for survival. And we know this because when we first learned of type 1 diabetes, it was killing people because without it, your body can't utilize energy. So we must have insulin. I'm not trying to get rid of anyone's insulin.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
What happens though is once insulin is released into our system, it is what is trying to help push energy into our tissues. And some people refer to it as like a key and lock system, that you need that key to get the energy into the tissue to be used. The problem is, as far as weight goes, Once insulin is activated in your system, it halts fat burning and it turns on fat storage.
Ah,
So technically, if we want to be using our fat or burning our fat, we don't want insulin on board unnecessarily. We only want it, enough of it, when we need it. And otherwise, we don't want it actively working in our system, if that makes sense.
yeah, that does. I'm sitting here with my mouth open going, wow, this is fascinating.
I'll give you an example then of why I believe that we have gone so far astray in our, again, first focusing on weight, but this also impacts health greatly.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been taught in our kind of nutritional advice and our guidelines and things that we should start with breakfast and we should eat a morning snack and we should eat lunch and we should eat an afternoon snack and we should eat dinner and we should probably eat an evening snack. So what happens is every time you put a bite of food in your mouth, insulin is activated. And insulin, once it's activated and is in your system, it stays for up to 3 or more hours. So let's just take this example. I eat at 8 a.m. So until at least 11, that insulin is active in my body. But I've been taught I should eat again at 10 o'clock. So at 10 o'clock, I eat again. So now more insulin, and the first insulin hasn't even receded yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep going every couple of hours. So I have insulin active in my system from 8 a.m. when I first eat, let's say until, 11 o'clock p.m. after I last eat at 8 p.m. So for those 15 hours, my body has been in fat storage mode and no fat burning has been able to take place.
Yeah. And it totally, I mean, it's blowing my mind because I'm like, yeah, I have been told for years to just that exact same process you're talking about of the breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but having the snacks in between, because I was told, well, it kind of helps manage the blood sugar levels and things like that. But the reality is that doesn't mean it's true, because if your insulin's already being released and it's not being used up, you're just constantly turning it on. And then it goes into, storing it.
So the only thing that, in my way of understanding it, that based on what you described, that is true, is that it helps keep you from big insulin spikes and then big drops.
Mm-hmm.
Because instead, we're just keeping it steady in our system the whole time. And unfortunately, this is why we're also seeing an increase in the rate of type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, because high levels of insulin chronically leads to insulin resistance. If your tissues are always being, that some insulin's always knocking on the door, here, we've got some more energy for you, it stops listening. So we become insulin resistant.
Wow.
Diabetes is the type 2 diabetes.
That's okay. And you're saying that part, if you're type 2 diabetes, you actually could do some of the reversal piece, like what you have done through this process. But it's also being able to make sure you're being checked out, I would imagine, checked out when you're doing like yearly exams or going to the doctor, to make sure you're getting your blood sugars checked ever so often, just so you kind of know, am I on track or am I not on track? Would that be a correct statement?
I think it's important. One of the things you and I have talked a little bit about is my approach and the information that I follow brings into question, I would say, kind of our traditional medical approach. And so unfortunately, many of your listeners have probably gone to the doctor and have been told, your blood sugar's fine, your blood sugar's fine, your blood sugar's fine. Because until it reaches a magical point on their scale, it's fine to them. Once it reaches a certain point, they call it prediabetes. And now they say you need to be careful. But in reality, if your blood sugar level is already being measured in that way, you have damage that is happening. And oftentimes the damage is really building for 10 to 15 years before a diagnosis.
Wow.
And so my concern is that if I just wait and go to the doctor and have them say, nope, your glucose level seems okay. You might want to watch it a little bit. I'm already causing damage that I'm not even aware of. And one of the challenges with the metabolic conditions is that, as with other things in the medical field, again, this magical number that means a diagnosis actually is concerning well before then. And I'll talk a few numbers here in case that helps.
Mm-hmm.
So one way a doctor would tell you about your blood sugar level, your blood glucose, is a measure that they do that's called the HbA1c. You may be familiar with that, or your
Mm-hmm.
listeners may be familiar with that. And it's basically a percentage of the blood sugar that's in your blood for the past 3 months. So it gives us a picture of, over the last 3 months, what that has looked like. They will diagnose diabetes when that number is 6.5. And just as an example, when I was diagnosed, mine was 13.1. So
Oh, wow.
pretty severely on that path.
Yeah.
But from other information that we know, we are having damage done within our body when our blood sugar level is like 5.5 or above. So an example would be some research that shows dementia and Alzheimer rates, that brain shrinkage basically
Mm-hmm.
increases the higher your HbA1c. So ideally, we would want that number like at 4.6 or 4.8. So if my doctor is okay with it being all the way up at 6.5 or, just below that, I'm already increasing my risk for dementia tremendously.
Yeah.
But I'm not being diagnosed with anything yet. And so I think your question is so important. And one of my challenges is I don't believe in the way that we test for things in this country and what we then do with it. And not just in this country, but and what we do with that information.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, your HbA1c is 6.0, you're fine. And I'm here to tell people they're not fine at 6.0.
Yeah.
They're just not showing up in the diabetic category yet.
And yeah, what you're talking about is it's doing damage in other ways, and you may not see it today, but
Mm-hmm.
like you're saying, 10 to 15 years down the road, whether it's the brain shrinkage or it's causing, I'm going to guess, other organ damage as well,
Mm-hmm.
that it's like, yeah, that's the whole importance of saying, it's being able to take care of you now versus,
Mm-hmm.
the waiting piece of it.
And I think this was, part of my own journey. When I was first diagnosed, I had a cavalier attitude about it. And, I was like 30 and I thought,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I'm really young for type 2 diabetes. I'm sure by the time I get old enough for this to really be a problem, they'll have, figured out a way to fix it by then. And so the reality that in not really managing it for the next 14 years, I allowed a lot more damage to be done in my body than what needed to happen. I could have taken a much more active role in correcting it then,
Mm-hmm.
but I just fell into the doctor said, well, put me on these medications and eventually I'll just go on more medications. And, I regret that decision now because I could have done things very differently.
And I also think, Terri, it's also just very human of us, right? When
Absolutely.
every developmental stage, every age group that we're in, it's really hard for us human beings to really see our future selves.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's like being 30 and going, oh yeah, no, it's not that severe yet. Or I can just take these medications and it'll all be okay. It's like, yeah, that's pretty spot on. But now you're saying it's like, hey, check this out. I've learned the hard way. It's like, I have done some damage, but I know I also reversed a lot of things that were going on as well.
Absolutely. And again, not just like with the type 2 diabetes, but risks of kidney damage and fatty liver disease and cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, dementia. Of course, as we get older, we start to see more of that in our friends and family. And now to feel empowered to know I'm doing things now to help ensure that I don't have to go down that path. I don't have to wait until I'm 75 to worry about dementia. I'm doing things about it now to help my brain and help prevent that from happening down the road.
What do you think really helped you kind of turn that belief system around versus, it's not a big deal now? What really kind of was that, I guess, pivotal moment for you to do the shifting?
I think it happened for me over a period of time, and sometimes even still didn't maybe react enough to it. But I remember years before I changed what I was doing, I was on 3 different medications for diabetes. I was on a cholesterol medication. I was on a blood pressure medication to try to protect my kidneys. So, I was in my mid 30s, late 30s on all these medications and everything. And I was having neuropathy, which is nerve pain in the side of my legs.
Mm.
And it just dawned on me that, wow, this is happening now. It's not going to be that I'm going to lose my toes when I get older, or I'm going to lose my sight when I get older. Like, I do feel some effects of this now.
Mm-hmm.
I think that really kind of shook me up. And then just getting to a point where I was so frustrated again with my weight and feeling like I had done so much to try to bring my weight to a healthy place, but just always felt like it was my fault that it wasn't working better. And so really just kind of dove into researching more about what could I do to help my health. And what I found as a side effect of that is it affected my weight because they're so linked.
Yeah.
And then I think another piece of it for me is once I started feeling better and seeing these changes, then I knew more and more, I do have control over this. This is within my power. And that has helped me to continue to make changes.
And it's just, I'm smiling here, and I know you can't see this, but I'm smiling because I'm thinking, wow, how empowering is that to really, what do I want to say? It's to challenge those beliefs that, you've got to deal with it, or this is all you got. It's like, no, that's not true. That you took the initiative to even dive deeper and to find resources and say, I can do this. And you're seeing the results and feeling better. That's amazing.
And I know this is in my bio on my website, but you and I haven't talked about it. Part of me in changing my health, my weight, and reversing the type 2 diabetes, I'm no longer on any of those medications.
Wow.
I don't take any prescription medications. And so, again, how empowering that was during this process as I started making changes to what I was doing and I started eliminating medications.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and started to see that they weren't actually resolving the issue. They were just trying to manage the symptoms.
Yeah.
And so I was going more at the root of why am I having this problem in my body and what can I do about that rather than what can I do just to manage those symptoms.
Oh, I love that. I think truly it's getting to the core of the issue, like you're saying, the root of the issue versus, I kind of like, let's put a Band-Aid on it and here we go. You're like, no, I want to go deeper than that. And I know there's some of the spiritual teachers that I follow, they actually talk about being able to heal your own body. And you're saying that you can do it through the certain types of food that you're eating, and you can actually see that changing. It not only changes your weight, but it's your overall health that you can make huge differences.
Absolutely.
I love it. Would you mind sharing, I guess, a few tips of some of the things that if women who are listening right now, maybe they've been diagnosed with a metabolic condition, or maybe they're on the verge, what are some things that they could possibly begin today or things that they could look into that would be able to help with this?
Sure. Well, I will own my absolute bias on the dietary piece of it, which I think is, one of the biggest fundamental aspects of it. And that is transitioning how we eat to a more ancestral diet. So focusing more on foods, whole foods, and foods that, our ancestors ate, because how we eat currently in this country has been very new in our overall history, and our body is not adapted to it. And this is, again, why we're seeing such an increase in these chronic conditions. So I think the first thing I believe in doing is looking at transitioning food into a more ancestral way of eating. And, if you want a label for those, they would be paleo, primal, and for some of us, ketogenic. So whole foods, eliminating some of the more problematic foods that are inflammatory, like processed oils, so vegetable oils, flour and grains, and sugar. So those three biggies that I know most of us.
Yeah, it's just like, oh man, I'm guilty of those.
Standard American diet, which is aptly described as SAD, SAD, Standard American Diet. We get about 50% of our daily intake from those three things. And so that's really a concern. So what we eat is really important, when and how often we eat. So as I talked about earlier, every time we put food in our mouth, we're priming insulin to be on board. And so the idea of not snacking, not eating between meals, not eating 5 or 6 small meals a day, those kinds of things. So what we eat, when we eat. And then the other thing I think that is important, as you said, kind of from a more spiritual place, is being good to our body, doing other things that facilitate healing and wellness for our body. For example, I'm really big into, if I'm going to spend so much energy and time in what I put in my body, it dawned on me, I should probably be focusing what I put on my body. Mm-hmm. And so I don't use any, kind of store-bought, any kinds of lotions or colognes or anything like that. I use all natural things. I make a lot of my products. I make my own laundry detergent. So really trying to cut down on the toxins that you put on your body, because those certainly interfere with, your mitochondria and your cells and everything being able to work properly. I do some practices like dry brushing in the morning before I take my shower, just to get the lymphatic fluid moving. Meditation. Trying to think. I do a lot as far as, first thing in the morning, sunlight exposure, so that my body can make the hormones that I need, like melatonin. Mm-hmm. And then throughout the day, work on not doing things that destroy those. So you can't see this right now, but I have on blue blocking glasses so that I'm not getting the effect of the blue light coming from my computer screen. Mm-hmm. Grounding, putting my bare feet into grass every day. I exercise, but I always use this caveat, because again, I think we've been taught this in a problematic way. If someone tells me they want to lose 20 pounds, one of the first things they always say is, well, I just need to get back to the gym. I need to start working out every day. And I couldn't believe that less. I believe in movement, but I believe in it for just overall health, conditioning, muscle tone, and then emotional and psychological well-being. Mm-hmm. But it is not a weight loss tool. So again, a way that my approach very much differs from kind of what we've had pushed on us for all these years.
Wow. Terri, what you're talking about, the not just what we're putting in our bodies and going back to really what our ancestors ate, which is the whole foods. And tell me just a little bit more. You said what you really kind of go off as ketogenic? Yeah. Tell me a little more. What is that?
Sure. Ketogenic refers to eating in a way that very much reduces the amount of carbohydrate that goes in, because there are 3 what we call macronutrients. All food is kind of divided into these 3 categories. It's either a carbohydrate, a protein, or fat. And carbohydrate have the biggest impact on insulin. They cause the most insulin to be released into the system. Mm. And so a carbohydrate, whether it's coming from a candy bar or whether it's coming from table sugar or whether it's coming from a banana, all come into our body as glucose. And glucose is what our body needs insulin to kind of counterbalance that effect on the blood sugar.
Okay.
So in general, my goal doing a ketogenic diet is I want my body to be burning the fuel of fat, not burning the fuel of glucose. So again, our standard American diet has most of us using the fuel of glucose most in our body furnace, which is also why we almost feel like we have to eat every couple of hours, because we burn through carbohydrates or glucose very quickly. It's like kindling on a fire. So you put a handful of kindling in, and 2 hours later it's gone and you need more. So the ketogenic way of eating is to get your body switched over to being a fat burning system. So it's like putting a giant log on that, in that furnace. You can go away for hours and burn that fat. And the reality is, all of us, unless you are a very extreme athlete who has like 3% body fat or something, all of us have enough body fat to fuel our body for quite a while. So again, especially if I want to lose weight, I want to be burning my fat. But my body won't do that while I'm fueling it with glucose.
Gotcha. So
the ketogenic diet is, of the ones that I mentioned, it's a little more extreme as far as the carbohydrate intake. I started with the paleo way of eating, and that just kind of allowed for more carbohydrate intake than what my body could handle. And so I eventually transitioned into doing more of a ketogenic way of eating.
Okay. Thank you for that. And to go back to what I had started to say too, before I even interrupted myself of train of thought there, was I love your process of how you've done this and the tips that you shared with our listeners today, because it really is what I talk about a lot with my clients. It's the mind, body, spirit. And you've hit all of that what you're putting into your system, the health food wise, but also taking the time for whether movement is more for the stretching and then connecting to the earth with going outside and being barefoot and sunlight. There's so much. It's a very well-rounded, basically, approach that you have to life. And I love how you have truly become so incredibly mindful of the products used that you're even making your own, which is amazing. I just really appreciate you coming on today and sharing all of this.
Sure.
I know we're running out of time here. Would you mind sharing your website for all of our listeners? So if they're looking to get more coaching on how they can do some of these things that you have talked about today, or they're needing that support to help them in this process, where could they find you?
Sure. My website it's www.healthlinkcoaching.com. And I'm going to spell that because it's a unique spelling. My company or my business name is HealthLink, HealthLynk. So that link, LYNK, stands for Health Like You Never Knew.
Oh, I love that.
So
Absolutely
it's healthlinkcoaching.com.
And I will have that on the show notes as well. So if you missed it and are driving or anything like that, no big deal. You can go out to the show notes and I'll have that information out there from Terri. So Terri, again, thank you so much for being on today, for sharing your knowledge and also just your own journey in this. And it just truly just blows me away how you have changed everything about what was going on in your body to now being in such a healthy place and not having to take any of those medications. That's just awesome.
Well, I appreciate getting to share it because that's what I want for everyone. I don't want people to feel like we are just cogs in the wheel of our kind of medical system.
Yeah, I love it. Well, thank you again.
And thank you.
If today's episode resonated with you and you are ready to make transformational changes in your life, to reclaim your power, your truth, and live with more ease, I invite you to schedule a 30-minute discovery call with me. Go to NicoleBurgessCoaching.com/inner truth.